Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So yesterday we started talking about World War One and how America got drug into it. Today we're going to talk about some involvement in the war, women's experiences on the home front and militarily, and what that's going to do for women's rights in the United States. A lot of what happens on the home front and how America shows up in wreck shop, and how the Treaty of Versailles that ends World War One is like the worst possible thing that could happen for world peace. Alright, let's go ahead and get started. So, women during World War One, their involvement in World War One is fundamentally going to change their political stance and their political power in the United States. So, millions of men were drafted and sent off to fight, and simultaneously there had to be tons and tons and tons of factory workers to produce the munitions and the guns and the things needed for the war effort. So if all the men just got drafted off and sent off to war, who's going to make all the bombs? Well, it's going to end up being women. And it was almost reluctantly done so, because there was the sexist idea at the time that women just could not produce the same amount of stuff as men could. So when it was like, oh, I guess all we have is women, and women were able to fill some of these jobs that had never previously been filled by women before, they produced the same amount that men can. And actually during World War One, since the expectations were higher, they actually produced more during World War One than men were producing before World War One. Because of this, women gained a lot more respect in the male-dominated society of the United States. So women were massively influential in the munitions creation, in the factory work in the United States during World War One. In addition, there were 13,000 women that joined the military. They were in non-combat positions, but I love the fact that the women that joined the Marines were referred to as Lady Hellcats. That's awesome. So, not just did women show up for this war, and we get involved in 1917. War's over in 1918. We wreck shop in World War One. So, talking about the women getting involved in the war effort, it's a lot more influential than just the 1 year that they were there. Women at this point in American history during World War I do not have the right to vote. Only men can vote in the United States. However, there has been a suffrage movement, which is the right to vote, that had been growing since the 1800s, and it hits a fever pitch in World War I, in which women are demanding the right to be able to vote and have influence in the government the same as men do. World War I is the final nail in that coffin of preventing women from doing that, because even Woodrow Wilson will come out and say, and he's like, yeah, I mean, obviously, if women can contribute equally to society as men, I think we've pretty much been wrong on this idea of not letting women vote. So, because of women's contributions in World War I, clearly symbolizing that women contribute equally to society as men, that the 19th Amendment is added to the Constitution, which gives women the right to vote. So women's contributions in World War I was the final push over the heel for women to get the right to vote, which, as we move forward in the rest of this unit and the rest of this course, you see the government all of a sudden, guess who they care about now? The government cares about women because women have the right to vote and can vote them out of office. So you'll see a lot more compassion and thought given to women because they have the right to vote, which is the most influential thing that you have in the United States is your ability to vote. And after World War I, women are going to gain that ability. So the question is here, explain why women were so valuable during World War I to help America gain an advantage over the Central Powers. So, you can pause me and answer that, but I'll clarify that here. So, women in World War I, they had to fill in for all the men. So we could produce more stuff than the rest of the world could because our factories are up and running. We're not getting bombed here in America But women gave us an entire workforce that we didn't have to go out. The rest of Europe is getting bombed and everybody's left their workforce. America basically just replaced our workforce with women and gave us a massive advantage over the Central Powers. So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. All right, we need to talk about war bonds and the Espionage and Sedition Acts. These sound like two really obscure things, but it's a very important story that happens in World War I. So, World War I is almost exclusively paid for by the war bonds. So, all these things we have to build to send off to war, and we're funding like the rest of the world. How does America get enough money for that? Well, we're getting it through something called war bonds. So, what war bonds are, you could like go to a bank. And I'll make up these numbers to clarify for you. But you go to the bank and you buy a war bond. They were called Liberty bonds at the time, but they're collectively referred to as war bonds. This is also how America pays for World War II. So you go to the bank and you're like, hey, I would like to buy a $5 war bond. So they give you a war bond. You give the bank $5. You have this piece of paper. It's a $5 Liberty bond or a war bond. All right. The bank will take the $5 and give it to the government for the war effort. So any money you spend for war bonds goes directly to the government to pay for this war. Now, the reason people do this, on top of just being patriotic, and there's some propaganda here created by the Committee on Public Information by George Creel, all right, which we talked about yesterday, which encourages you to buy, be a patriot, buy these war bonds. There's an incentive for it. Because once the war ends and America wins, and those are two things that have to happen. America has to win and the war ends. You can take that war bond back that you paid $5 for, take it back to the bank, give it back to the bank, and the bank will give you $10 for it. So you're basically investing in the success of America, all right, in your belief that America is going to be well and do well in this war so you can make a profit. So when do you think people are going to be lined up around the block to buy war bonds? Well, typically it's at the end of the war, right before America wins, and then everybody wants to buy them because then they can just take it back the next day and sell them back and make a profit. Because of that, all right, this is why the Committee on Public Information that we talked about yesterday, the CPI, headed by George Creel, his job is so important because he has to constantly make Americans think the war is going to end any moment now so that people buy all these war bonds so the government has enough money to fund these, so that you can fund this war. All right? Makes sense? Cool. There was these things called the Espionage and Sedition Acts. That came out during World War I. Now, at first, they're kind of designed here to basically prevent you from talking trash about the war. They want to make sure that you're not giving away any secrets. Like if you happen to be working in a munitions plant, you're not allowed to talk about how many bombs you're making. That way, spies can't get a hold of that information and know how good America's doing at things. But the Espionage and Sedition Acts also, all right, make it illegal to talk trash about the government. You can't even say, I don't like the war is stupid. You can't say that. Now, the reason the government makes that rule is because the war is being paid for with war bonds. Something that people have to think the war is going good in order to be buying war bonds. If people stop liking the war, they may stop buying war bonds, and therefore it will hurt the war effort. So the government makes it illegal to talk trash about the government or the war during World War I. Well, it's a constitutional amendment with the First Amendment with the freedom of speech that says you can be critical of your government. There's a guy who starts passing out pamphlets. His name's Charles Schneck. Charles Schneck, very famous in World War I because he was very much against the war. He was very much against the draft. He said that the 13th Amendment, which freed slaves, basically said involuntary servitude, slavery, is outlawed in America. And he says the draft, That's a version of involuntary servitude, and therefore it's wrong, and you shouldn't support the war. And he passes out all these pamphlets. Well, the Espionage and Sedition Acts say he's not allowed to talk trash about the government. So they go arrest Charles Schneck for talking trash about the government. This makes its way all the way to the Supreme Court in the Supreme Court case of Schneck versus the United States. And he says, you can't arrest me for talking trash about the government. I have a right. My First Amendment right says I can talk trash about the government. The government disagrees. The government says, well, hold on now. There's rules to the First Amendment. So what's interesting here, and we'll see this in World War II, Korematsu versus the United States as well, that America has these rights in the Constitution that are supposed to defend the American public from the government. Yet the government is the one that gets the right to interpret it and enforce the things that are supposed to protect the people from the government. This is an example of this, because the government comes out and says, yeah, freedom of speech isn't unlimited. There are absolutely limits on freedom of speech. And the example they give here in Schneck versus the United States is you can't go into a crowded movie theater and scream fire and then think when there's no fire and then assume you're protected under freedom of speech, even though you've caused, a stampede and people getting run over and people being hurt. So Schneck versus the United States basically says, because it is so important for the people to like the war, so that they will buy war bonds, it actually hurts the war effort and puts soldiers in danger if you talk trash about the war and try to negatively impact the war effort, and that the federal government has the right to put limits on freedom of speech in times of war when it comes down to public safety. And that's why they use the acknowledgement of screaming fire in a movie theater. But Schneck versus the United States in World War I limits the rights of Americans of when and when not the First Amendment applies. So the question is, explain how the need for people to buy war bonds directly contributed to restrictions on the First Amendment rights during the Great War. So pause me, answer that completely, and we'll move on. So, and this is probably the thing you've been waiting for 2 lessons is, so tell us about the fighting. So it's really cool and it's really quick because America shows up and just wrecks shop. I mean, it's not even close. So America shows up, and while we didn't necessarily, like, the tank wasn't invented like the day we showed up, we just have more. We can make them faster. We wreck shop. So the machine gun is what was keeping everybody in the trenches. These tanks that can just roll across the top of the trenches, and notice the guns are on the side of the tanks. They just would annihilate the trenches, and then all of a sudden people don't use trenches anymore, and it's a more of a traditional warfare. And so America shows up. The main thing is America's not worn out from war. We haven't been fighting for 3 years. These people are starving to death and just awful. America shows up and is like, whoo! We show up with tanks. We basically eliminate the whole need for trench warfare. And by the time America shows up, so let me walk you through this timeline here of how quickly this happens. All right. So the war starts in 1914. Crazy stuff happens in 1915. The Lusitania assumptions start getting angry. 1916, more stuff. We're not involved. 1917, America's like, you know what? It's go time. America's in. All right. So America joins the war. Russia dips out on their own. That's a whole nother thing. America joins the war. The next year, America wins. Excuse me. The Allies win. So, war starts in 1914. America joins in 1917. 1918, the war ends. Like, we wreck shop. Nobody can really fight back against this. Germany just gets completely pushed out of France. And then Germany's like, fine. All right, we clearly have no chance of winning this. All their allies had already just been, like, on fire. So, everybody's blaming Germany. Germany's like, fine, we're done fighting. And on November 11th, 1918, Germany signs the armistice to end this war. Now, an armistice means ceasefire. It is not the treaty that officially ends the war. which is odd because most of the times you celebrate when a treaty is signed. In World War One, it was so horrible. People were just happy when the fighting started. Millions and millions and millions of people had died in World War One, and they all get to travel back home. Everybody is like super happy that the war is just, the fighting is over. So is it a very significant date? So it actually happened at 11 a.m., all right, on that day. So the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, Germany just admits that they lost. That's all. I admit that they lost. A treaty is all the punishments and who owes who what and how you're going to divide stuff up. That thing's going to take 6 months, and that's called the Treaty of Versailles. It's really important. But the famous one is actually the armistice, because you're never in school on Armistice Day. It's not called Armistice Day. November 11th, you're never in school because it's called Veterans Day, because that is when World War I ended. And it is not just an American holiday, it is a worldwide holiday in which you honor the people that have fought for their country. So November 11th, 1918 is the end of the war. Germany admits that they lost. And I mean, America just shows up in wreck shop. And so that's the question here. Explain how America was able to quickly end the fighting in World War I. I mean, with our tanks, the main thing is we just weren't tired. They had been so worn out from war, these soldiers that had been in these trenches for years and starving to death on both sides, that America shows up fresh, and there's just I mean, they can hardly fight back against America. Not to mention our superior technology with being able to mass produce tanks. Our production, because our factories were in full production mode. Most of their factories in Europe were destroyed. The production, not worn out. It was pretty quick work done by the Americans. So Americans don't have the massive loss of life that the rest of the world does. So, but we'll get to that later on. So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. So now what's important is to actually come up with the treaty that's going to end this war. All right. So the fighting's over. Everybody's gone home. All the armies have gone home. Now let's come up with the solution to the problem that was the war. All right. So Woodrow Wilson is the president. He actually personally goes to Europe. They're going to meet in France in a place called Versailles. It's spelled Versailles, but it's pronounced Versailles. And he shows up, and they call themselves the Big Four. All right. Here on the left, you got David Lloyd George. All right. You got Orlando here next to him. All right. Remember, Italy switched sides halfway through. Italy just really wants to get the territories of the winning side. That was the whole reason they jumped in. And then they switched sides when they realized Germany wasn't going to win. George Clemenceau is the leader of France. And then Woodrow Wilson here on the far right. That is the American leader. These are the only people who get to have any say-so in this meeting. There were other countries that showed up for the Allies, like Japan, who got completely discounted here, causes some hostilities that will grow leading into World War II. But who else is suspiciously absent from these treaty talks? Germany. Germany isn't even allowed to show up, which should have been the first sign this is not going to go well. Because when Woodrow Wilson shows up, his entire goal is to prevent this from ever happening again. So Wilson shows up. So Wilson leaves America, because keep in mind, America showed up. We saved everybody. That is our mentality. He is treated like a hero when he rolls into Europe. There's like parades and stuff for hooray, Woodrow Wilson in America came in and stopped this war. So he expects to be able to have a lot of clout here when he presents his ideas on how to prevent this from ever happening again. He calls it his 14 points. And you can read them all there next to me if you're interested. If you remember your intricacies of all the things that cause this to happen. Basically, what Woodrow Wilson wants is a just and lasting peace. He wants to make sure there's never going to be anything like a World War II. That would be crazy. He wants to make sure this never happens again. So these are 14 things that everybody should agree on, all right? And it is fair to all sides. You know, like no secret alliances, militarism is bad. You know, the things that caused World War One. And he actually had 13 of them. And then at the very end, he's like, you know what? I should create this thing called a League of Nations. So the League of Nations is his 14th point. He calls it his Association of Nations here. But his League of Nations is basically like a big public alliance so that this group would be so big and powerful, nobody would ever want to like mess with one of those countries because all those countries would retaliate against the country that was picking the fight. And basically preventing war, but doing it publicly so everybody can see it so that it's not, you know, nobody doesn't lead all these war declarations like what happened in World War One. So he thinks he is going to show up with these 14 points and everybody was going to be super happy about him. I'll go back to this one. This is a better picture. He thinks everybody's going to be really happy about him. So when he shows up and he starts presenting these 14 points, he realizes things are different than he was expecting. So his whole goal here is a just and lasting peace. England and France's entire goal here is to punish Germany. They're not ready for let bygones be bygones again. They are viciously angry at the amount of casualties and people that died at the hands of German soldiers. And England and France just want to punish Germany. Italy, all they want to do is gain land, and they realize a good way of punishing Germany is to take their land from them. So the other three, meaning Italy, England, and France, when they get here, they just want to like kick Germany while they're down. They don't actually have any intent on a just and lasting peace. So Woodrow Wilson's points just get rejected one after another because all these things are supposed to make society fair in Europe. The other three, they don't want it fair. They want to be able to team up against Germany from here on. And Woodrow Wilson is horrified to realize that there is no actual striving for peace now. They are just like almost continuing this war in a political fashion of like kicking Germany while they're down here at the end. The only thing they actually want to keep, which is Italy, England, and France, is the 14th point, which is the League of Nations, because they think America is going to be involved in it. And they're like, yes, we like the League of Nations, because now when we all team up against Germany, if America is involved in our League of Nations, we can force America to beat up on Germany too. When Woodrow Wilson realizes that the League of Nations is going to be used for aggression as opposed to like a peacemaking thing, he becomes, and America in general becomes less excited about the idea of the League of Nations. But England and France do like the League of Nations. So the question here is, explain what Woodrow Wilson's goal was when he arrived at Versailles and what the goals were of the other three main countries in attendance. So pause me, answer that completely. Moving on. So the Treaty of Versailles. This is the official treaty that's going to end the war. Woodrow Wilson has really no say-so in this because it's Italy, England, and France that are going to do all the dictating here. Germany is just going to be required to agree to any. They're not even allowed to be at this meeting. Whatever they come up with, Germany, basically with a gun to their head, is going to be forced to sign this. So the Treaty of Versailles is pretty mean to Germany, and that's an understatement. So one of the first things it does is it creates 9 new nations. So the ones here that are kind of pinkish, these are all new nations that get created at the end of World War One. So the reason these nations need to get taken over is so about the middle of all those countries, that was Germany. So a lot of this land got taken from the original Germany. But Russia, see, they're not at this meeting either because Russia had already backed out with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Right? They had already backed out. So when they backed out, Germany demanded that Russia give Germany this land at their border, which Russia did. So Germany actually grew bigger in World War One. So here at the Treaty of Versailles, they have to not only give up all their land that they took from Russia, which will be an independent country, but they also have to give up some of their own personal land to make those countries large enough to, to function and survive. So it takes land from them. It takes a very important piece of land from Germany called Alsace-Lorraine, so the whole yellow area here, this is France. The red area, that is like a state. That is a very wealthy area of land with natural resources that is taken from Germany and given to France. It's called Alsace-Lorraine. So Germany then has to pay reparations in the sum of $33 billion. That's like make-believe money. So Germany, who's no longer allowed to have a military, all right, all their territories around the world, Alsace-Lorraine, any territories around the country, around the world, got given to Italy. It's basically like being fired from your job. Germany has no way of making money now. Now they have $33 billion with a B, billion dollars in reparations. They have to pay back to England and France for all this horrible stuff that England and France blames Germany for. And if they don't do that, then England and France can like take over Germany. On top of that, and this one is just spiteful, they make Germany sign the War Guilt Clause. The War Guilt Clause is basically anything bad that happened during the war, Germany basically has to admit it was their fault. Basically, like, it's basically forcing Germany to be like, I'm a big doo-doo head. I'm a bad person. Nobody likes me. I know this. And like England and France are right, like, yeah, make them sign that. So England and France are writing out all this like stuff where it's like, Germany and stupid and bad. And then they force Germany to sign this. That actually doesn't benefit anybody. That's just being a bully. Like, making them sign the War Guilt Clause is just, it is blatantly just disrespectful. There's nothing England and France gain out of it. It's just trying to humiliate Germany, all right? And like this cartoon shows, Germany has no say-so. They have to sign this. They have to sign the Treaty of Versailles. America's pretty horrified by this. So this picture here is supposed to be David Lloyd George and George Clemenceau from England and France leading the leader of Germany here to slaughter, which is Kaiser Wilhelm II, who's the leader of Germany at the time. Woodrow Wilson is pleading with England and France to like, let's not go execute Germany, all right? Because this is basically what the Treaty of Versailles is doing. Now, this is just a cartoon. They're not actually executing Kaiser Wilhelm II. They actually let Germany's government remain in place. The reason they let Germany's government remain in place is because you have to have somebody pay you back these $33 billion. This is the government that's going to sign the Treaty of Versailles, who is going to be responsible to pay back that $33 billion. So once the Treaty of Versailles gets signed, all right, it is clearly just super mean to Germany. The League of Nations is part of this. And even though it was America's idea, America realizes it basically like ties our hands. We are committed to all these different groups that we don't really want to be committed to now. So even though it was our idea, and it was Woodrow Wilson's idea, it doesn't mean it's automatically a law. Congress has to approve it. So everybody else in Europe joins the League of Nations, or England and France does, joins the League of Nations. America decides, nah, we're not going to join. And America actually never joins the League of Nations because we realize it's going to be used for aggression and just being more mean to Germany. And we don't want to have anything to do with it. The people in America are pretty upset about how awful this is of treatment of Germany, because this is awful for peace. And as this cartoon very accurately portrays, there's a very famous person in German history, a guy named Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler is going to rise to power after this, in large part because the people in Germany are so beat down from the Treaty of Versailles, they're willing to follow this complete psychopath because he presents himself as a quality leader at this time. Without the Treaty of Versailles destroying the German economy and society, there's really a much smaller chance that this man would ever have come to power. But so Adolf Hitler, there is a strong connection between Adolf Hitler rising to power and the events that happened here that led to the Treaty of Versailles that's going to end World War One. And America is like, this is the dumbest thing we've seen. We came here, saved y'all, and this is how y'all respond, by just like increasing tensions. Like, we want to prevent this from happening, and England and France don't want to hear anything about it. They just want to beat up on Germany, and we're like, fine, you know what? We're going home. Y'all deal with this from now on. So the question here is, explain how the Treaty of Versailles is bad for lasting peace in Europe after World War One. Because how does Germany feel about the rest of the world? It's not like, oh, we had this awful battle, let's make up. It is they are being vilified for this. And when countries hate each other, like England and France hate Germany, and Germany now hates England and France, that is not good for lasting peace. Had they, honestly, historically, had they followed Wilson's 14 points, very small chance that World War II would have ever happened. So pause me, answer that completely. See you guys tomorrow.